Harlem didn't breathe without permission. Not at night. Not when the neon signs of the jazz clubs bled onto the wet pavement. In the last of the days, honest men had locked their doors. The air itself, thick with the smell of coal smoke and fried fish, seemed to hold its posture, waiting for a signal. Power in this kingdom wasn't held by the men in blue uniforms who patrolled the avenues with nervous hands on their holsters. It wasn't held by the politicians who made promises in the daylight. Here, in the heart of the city's beating, black heart, power was a quiet thing. It rested in a single man, and Bumpy Johnson was awake. He sat in the back of a dimly lit cafe, the steam from a cup of black coffee curling into the shadows. From his throne of worn leather, he watched the world he owned. The kingdom was orderly. The numbers were right. The streams of revenue flowed as they should, tributaries into a great, silent river. But a river can be poisoned. A single drop is all it takes. For weeks, a feeling had settled in his bones, a cold, hard certainty that a leak had been sprung. Not a crack, but a pinhole, bleeding pressure, so slowly only the man who built the machine would notice. There was no evidence, no loud mistake, no missing cash or misplaced product. It was something else, an echo in the rhythm of the streets, a flicker of information arriving where it shouldn't, a half second before it was due. A ghost was walking through his walls, someone who wore a familiar face and shared his bread. Most leaders would have started turning over rocks, shaking trees, making noise. They would have mistaken motion for progress. Bumpy Johnson knew better. Noise was a weakness. Noise was a confession of panic. He would not hunt the ghost. He would let the ghost come to him. He would let it reveal itself in the quiet, because betrayal, like all things in his world, had a rhythm. He just had to listen. And as he listened, Harlem held its breath, sensing the change in barometric pressure, the coming of a storm that would make no sound. The first sign of betrayal. The tells were never loud. They were whispers on the wind, seen only by a man who made a study of silence. Bumpy Johnson's power wasn't just in the men who answered his call. It was in his unblinking observation of the world he had built, brick by loyal brick. He understood that betrayal began not with an act, but with a thought. And a thought always, eventually, revealed itself. It started with a look. One of his most trusted lieutenants, a man who had been at his side for years, held his gaze for a fraction of a second too long. It wasn't a challenge. It was a query, a silent, nervous question asked of a king, not by a subject, but by a peer. In that fleeting moment, Bumpy saw it. The man was no longer just watching him for instruction. He was watching him for a reaction. He was gauging him. It was a subtle shift, the kind a wife sees in a husband who has strayed, the kind a father sees in a son who has lied. The deference was still there, a well-worn coat the man put on every morning. But underneath, the posture had changed. Days later, a second sign. A meeting was called to discuss a new enterprise, a potential expansion into a territory that required careful, strategic pressure. Bumpy laid out a fraction of the plan, a piece of the blueprint, and watched the faces around the table. He watched who listened and who was merely hearing. The traitor wasn't the one who asked the most questions. He was the one who asked the smartest question, a question that showed he had already considered angles Bumpy hadn't yet offered. It was a small, almost impressive display of foresight. But it was too much foresight. It spoke of conversations had in other rooms, of hypotheticals explored with a different audience. The man wasn't just thinking ahead. He was reporting ahead. He was stress-testing Bumpy's plan for another master. Then came the money. Not a theft. The count was always perfect, to the dollar. It was the timing. A collection from a high-stakes numbers runner came in an hour early. An envelope delivered before the courier had even been dispatched. The man responsible for that sector, the same man with the flickering gaze, offered a proud, efficient explanation. He was simply making things run smoother, he claimed, getting ahead of the game. Bumpy nodded, his expression a mask of calm approval. But he knew. Efficiency was one thing. Clairvoyance was another. Someone was moving his pieces on his board, but they were doing it out of turn. They were anticipating his moves, not because they were loyal, but because they were feeding the playbook to a rival team. The man wasn't a thief. A thief was simple. A thief could be replaced. This was something far more dangerous. This was a mirror, and it was showing his reflection to the world. The time for observation was over. The time for confirmation had arrived. A lesser man would have called the suspect to a private room, laid a pistol on the table, and demanded the truth through a curtain of threats and fury. But Bumpy Johnson did not deal in confessions. A confession was a liar's last resort, a desperate plea for mercy. He dealt in facts, in truths that revealed themselves not through pressure, but through opportunity. The surest way to catch a snake was to build it a warm, inviting nest and see if it would enter. The nest was a rumor, born in Bumpy's mind and whispered into the ear of a single, impeccably loyal, but notoriously loose-lipped underling. The rumor was a masterpiece of temptation. It spoke of a new shipment, a massive one, coming in from the south. Not the usual contraband, but something new, something highly valuable and entirely off the books. The rumor detailed a specific weakness in the plan, a new driver, a change in the route, a single point of vulnerability where the shipment could be intercepted with minimal risk and maximum reward. It was a flaw so plausible, so tempting, it would be an insult to a rival's intelligence not to act on it. Bumpy designed the rumor like a key for a very specific lock. He seeded it with details only the traitor, given his position and oversight, would recognize as credible. The location was in his sector. The logistics involved men he managed. To anyone else, it was just a story. To the traitor, it would sound like a symphony of opportunity, a gift from a careless god. Bumpy then let the rumor breathe, releasing it into the ecosystem of Harlem's underworld like a single drop of ink in a glass of water. He changed nothing in his routine. He met with his lieutenants, the traitor among them, his face a study in placid command. He discussed the daily business, the collections, the disputes, the slow and steady churn of his empire. He looked the traitor in the eye, offered him the same measured respect, the same quiet confidence he always had. He gave the man no reason to feel watched, no cause for alarm. This was the core of his strategy, to remain so perfectly still that his silence became a vacuum, pulling the truth toward him. While the traitor believed he was maneuvering in the shadows, he was, in fact, walking down a brightly lit corridor, designed and built by the very man he sought to undermine. The city buzzed. The whispers of the great shipment reached the ears of those who mattered, the other powers who watched Bumpy's kingdom with hungry eyes. Bumpy listened to the echoes of his own creation. He felt the subtle shifts in the city's energy. The test was live. The trap was set. Now, there was nothing to do but wait. He knew the man's greed, his ambition, the gnawing insecurity that had led him down this path. He wasn't just testing the man's loyalty. He was leveraging his predictable, pathetic human nature. The waiting was not idle. It was a form of pressure in itself, the terrible, patient silence of a judge who had already decided the verdict and was merely waiting for the defendant to finish hanging himself. Confirmation. The confirmation did not arrive with a bang. There was no failed heist, no chaotic shootout on a darkened street. That was the clumsy work of common gangsters, a mess of blood and noise that solved nothing. Bumpy Johnson's trap was designed to spring silently, to deliver not a body, but a piece of information, a single, undeniable fact. It came in the form of a phone call, not to him, but to one of his rivals, a man with whom Bumpy maintained a cold, professional understanding. The call was placed by a third party, an informant on Bumpy's payroll who existed for the sole purpose of listening to the conversations of other kings. The message was simple, relayed to Bumpy over a secure line in the dead of night. His rival had made a move, a quiet one. He had reallocated resources, pulling men from their usual posts and positioning them along the exact route detailed in Bumpy's fabricated rumor. He wasn't preparing for a war. He was preparing for a surgical interception, a gift delivery. The traitor had taken the bait. He had heard the rumor, recognized its potential, and passed the key to his new master. He had sold a secret that was never real, and in doing so, had revealed a truth that was irreversible. He had signed his name to a confession he never spoke. Bumpy received the news with no more reaction than a man confirming the time on a grandfather clock. There was no satisfaction, no anger, just the cold click of a final piece falling into place. The board was clear to him now. Every move the traitor had made over the past months replayed in his mind, no longer as isolated incidents, but as a clear, pathetic pattern of deceit. The lingering look, the too astute question. the unnatural efficiency. It was all a prelude to this one final act of self-betrayal. The empire remained oblivious. Harlem slept, unaware of the tectonic plates shifting beneath its streets. The traitor himself slept, likely dreaming of the reward to come, of the elevation he believed he had earned. He felt safe in his anonymity, shielded by the belief that he was smarter, quicker, more subtle than the man he served. He did not understand that Bumpy Johnson's silence was not ignorance. It was a crucible. He did not know that his fate had been sealed, not in that moment, but weeks ago, the first time he let his eyes betray his heart. The kingdom was safe. The fictional shipment would never manifest. The rival's men would wait on a lonely road for a ghost that would never arrive. But for the traitor, the ghost of his own future had just walked over his grave. And Bumpy Johnson was the only one who saw it. The punishment. The punishment began on a Tuesday. It was a day like any other. The sun rose over Harlem. The merchants opened their stalls, and the numbers runners began their daily rounds. The traitor woke up in his comfortable apartment, a man of status and means, respected on his block, feared by those beneath him. He had no idea that he was already a dead man. He had no idea his ghost was about to become his only companion. Bumpy Johnson did not believe in the swift mercy of a bullet. A bullet was forgettable. It was the slow, methodical erasure of a man's existence that served as a true lesson. The first thread was pulled from his financial life. The man owned a small, legitimate business on the side, a laundromat, a front for his real earnings, but a source of immense pride. That morning, he received a notice from his bank. His business loan, held for 3 years without issue, had been recalled. The reason was a vague technicality, a newly discovered risk in his portfolio. He tried to call his banker, a man who had always taken his calls. The secretary informed him the banker was unavailable, indefinitely. At the same time, the supplier for his detergents and machinery informed him they would now be operating on a cash-on-delivery basis only. His line of credit, once a given, had vanished in a thin air. By the afternoon, the social strangulation had begun. He walked into his favorite restaurant for lunch, a place where the owner always greeted him with a handshake and a free glass of whiskey. Today, the owner nodded curtly and pointed him to a small, undesirable table in the back, near the kitchen. The air around him grew cold. The usual greetings from other patrons were replaced with averted eyes and sudden, intense interest in their menus. He was no longer a man to be seen with. He had become a contaminant. He left without eating, the taste of ash in his mouth. The third blow was to his authority. He went to oversee one of his crews, the men who collected protection money from local shop owners. He gave an order, a simple instruction he had given 100 times before. The men looked at him, then at each other. One of them, a man who had once feared him, simply said, "We'll have to check on that." It wasn't defiance. It was a statement of fact. His word, once law, was now a suggestion pending approval from a higher, unseen power. He had been stripped of his rank without a formal demotion. His uniform had been rendered invisible. The final act was the most devastating because it was the most personal. For weeks, this slow-motion collapse continued. His car was repossessed. His landlord informed him his lease would not be renewed. Friends he had known since childhood stopped answering his calls. He was being surgically removed from the society he had spent his life building. He was broke, isolated, and powerless. He was a ghost haunting the scenes of his own life. Then, one evening, as he sat alone in his nearly empty apartment, there was a knock on the door. It was a young boy, a neighborhood kid. He handed the man a small, velvet bag and left without a word. Inside was a gold pocket watch, a gift the man had given Bumpy Johnson years ago as a sign of his undying loyalty. There was no note. There didn't need to be. The message was absolute. I gave you this life. I gave you this power. And I have now taken it all back. I even own your loyalty, right down to the memory of it. Harlem never saw a body. There was no funeral, no public execution. One day, a man who mattered was simply a man who did not. He was seen occasionally, a hollow figure walking the streets that were once his, now invisible to the people who once feared him. Bumpy Johnson had not killed him. He had unmade him. And in doing so, he sent a message far more terrifying than any gunshot could. Betrayal would not cost you your life. It would cost you your existence. Harlem reacts. The silence in Harlem was louder than any scream. The man didn't vanish in a shroud of mystery. He became a living specter, a cautionary tale whispered in hushed tones in the back rooms of bars and the shadowed corners of barbershops. No one dared speak his name. To do so would be to acknowledge the abyss, to look too closely at the quiet, absolute power that could erase a man from his own life. He became the Walker, the man who had everything and then had nothing, stripped bare not by a rival's blade, but by a king's judgment. People saw him. They saw him waiting in line for a bowl of soup at the church. They saw him sleeping on a bench in the park he once considered his private garden. They saw the fine coat he once wore become tattered, the confident stride dissolve into a defeated shuffle. And in seeing him, they understood the nature of Bumpy Johnson's rule. It was not a reign of terror, but a reign of order. The Walker had not been a victim of chaos. He had been a casualty of its correction. The lesson rippled through the underworld with chilling efficiency. Loyalty was no longer just a currency. It was a shield. Men who had felt stirrings of ambition, who had entertained thoughts of making their own connections, suddenly found a renewed and profound appreciation for the structure Bumpy provided. They looked at their own comfortable lives, the respect, the money, the security, and then they looked at the Walker, and they understood the transaction. Their prosperity was a loan, granted in exchange for unwavering fidelity. Bumpy Johnson's generosity was deep, but his memory was deeper. Fear took on a new texture. It wasn't the hot, panicked fear of unpredictable violence. It was a cold, intelligent fear, a fear of being seen, a fear of being understood. Men began to watch their own words, to police their own thoughts. They understood that Bumpy Johnson's gaze was not just on their actions, but on their intentions. He didn't need to hear a disloyal word to know a disloyal heart. He had proven he could see the rot before the fruit began to fall. The other powers in the city took notice as well. They had seen Bumpy's trap for what it was, a quiet, masterful play that cost nothing in blood or treasure, yet yielded an invaluable return. He had consolidated his power, tightened his organization, and sent a message to every would-be challenger, all without firing a single shot. They had been waiting for a sign of weakness, a crack in the foundation. Instead, Bumpy had shown them a fortress whose walls were not made of stone, but of a silence more formidable than any army. The balance of power had shifted, not with a bang, but with a whisper that echoed across the entire city. Legendary ending. The seasons turned. The Walker faded from memory, a ghost finally absorbed by the city's indifference. Harlem's rhythm returned to its steady, familiar beat, but the composition had changed. A new note had been added, a deep, resonant tone of unwavering respect. The machine ran smoother than ever. The leaks were sealed. The streams of revenue flowed, clean and strong. Bumpy Johnson sat in his usual chair, in his usual cafe, the city's pulse throbbing around him. He had not celebrated the victory. He had taken no pride in the dismantling of a man he had once trusted. The entire affair had been a matter of maintenance, a simple, necessary recalibration of his world. A flawed component had been identified and removed. It was a problem of engineering, not a passion. His expression was unchanged, his posture relaxed, his dominance resting in the quiet certainty that his kingdom was, once again, in perfect alignment. He had not made an example of the traitor. He had made him a lesson. An example is loud, temporary, and designed to be seen. A lesson is silent, permanent, and designed to be understood. The men in his circle were not just more loyal now. They were smarter. They understood that the ultimate punishment was not to be removed from the game, but to be left on the board with no moves to make, a king with no subjects, a man with no name. As he lifted his coffee cup, the light from the street caught the face of his own watch, a simple, elegant timepiece. It wasn't a trophy. It was a tool, a reminder that the most powerful weapon in any war was time. Time to watch, time to wait, time to allow a man's own character to become his executioner. Bumpy Johnson didn't punish betrayal by spilling blood. He punished it by letting the traitor's own heart run dry, so perfectly and so quietly that the only thing left to bury was a memory. And nobody ever tried to betray him again.